Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me and beside me today. I talk about tropical houseplants. So this is going to be a continuation of the plant review series, and we are welcoming back for this video the Monstera Albo, one of my two Monstera Albos. And as I've done with the previous review, which was the revisit of the Philodendron gloriosum, if you haven't seen that, I will link it at the top there. But this is going to be another revisit. And if I'm not mistaken, at this point, these plants have been with me for 4 years. I think my second Monstera, which is slightly older, might be with me for 5 years. But I will put a note somewhere so you can see it. But the title of the video, I think, will be based on this plant, which would be a year later from the previous video. Yeah. Hopefully that makes sense. But I'll also link the previous review here if you want to see that as well and you haven't. But yes, so we will be diving into this plant again a year later since the previous review, see what has changed. Has anything been different? How my experiences have been? Has anything drastic happened? But before we dive into any of that, let's get into some ground rules. Now, if you're one of the people that have come back, welcome back. It's always nice to have you. You know the deal by this point. Down in the progress bar below, you should be able to find your favorite sections if you want to skip to a specific part of the video. However, if you are new and joining for the first time, welcome to the slight insanity that is this plant review series. And as I always start with these kind of ground rule sections, this review, there is no way for it to be unbiased. It is my biased review of my specific plant in my conditions, which is growing in a conservatory in the UK and whatever that might mean. Also a very old conservatory, which I've started to get quotes recently to get it replaced, so I cannot wait. So yeah, it's that reality basically for me, and it's my plant. However, I do encourage you, if you've got this plant, if you've got some experiences that you want to share about this specific plant, please drop it in the comments down below. I'm sure myself and everybody else watching this video would really appreciate any kind of experiences that you've had. But without further ado, let's get into the first topic. So going into the first topic, which is background on this plant, and some of this might be repetition if you've seen the first video, but let's bring everybody up to speed essentially. So this, as I mentioned in the beginning, is the second of two Monstera Albos that I've got. I will add clips of the first one purely because I can see it from here and it's quite high up and it's very heavy and it's even larger than this one. That one has significantly lower variegation levels than this one. And that was part of the reason why I got this. So the first one, the story goes that when I was first starting with my plant journey, and you can tell by how long I've had it. So the story goes that with the first Albo that I have, and again, I will add pictures and hopefully I might even have a picture here from my plant care app on when I first got that one. And it was from somebody on Instagram that was doing a purge essentially. So they were getting rid of some of their plants, or at least they were chopping up one of the Monstera albos that they had. And it was a bit like a silent auction. You all kind of put your bid in. Not that many people were aware of it or aware of albos as they are now. They weren't anywhere near as prevalent. So I put a bid in thinking, you know what, I'm probably not going to get it. I bid relatively low, but also for cutting of the Alba that didn't have an awful lot of variegation because I just wanted to trial it out. I didn't want to go full hog for something that had a lot of variegation. I also knew that those cuttings from that specific plant that this person was chopping up and selling were probably going to go for a lot more than I was willing to at least part with at that point. And if I'm not mistaken, I can tell you the price. I think I paid 40 Great British pounds, which was a lot of money for a one leaf cutting, unrooted as well at that point, of an Albo. But at that point in time, for how much like single leaf cuttings were going, even with not an awful lot of variegation, but with still a leaf and a node rather than just a wet stick, it wasn't too bad, believe it or not. So I got it then. I kind of started rooting it out. It didn't have an awful lot of variegation. I kind of learned a lot along the way of how to kind of treat and care for that plant, but it was a particularly slow plant. Considering as well how little variegation it had, it could have been a lot faster. Now, there was a debate for a long period of time where we were still calling the Monstera Albo the Monstera Borsigiana Albo Variegated Monstera. I've seen a lot of chatter online now, and I don't know whether or not we are dropping the Borsigiana and it's just a Monstera Albo at this point. But I'll be curious to see what you've seen online as well. Maybe drop it down in the comments below. I'd love to have that conversation because I don't know whether or not the Borsigiana aspect of it has been dropped, or maybe the large form Monstera has been dropped as a concept. I don't know. But regardless, it is a very, very cool plant. And this is definitely one that over the years, I don't think has lost a lot of its popularity. It's become a lot more available, but I'll touch on availability at a later date. The second Albo that had a lot more variegation, I got from Sarah at Eastern Tropicals. And I got this again, I think it was an unrooted cutting. I will add a picture here. And it was interesting because when I first got this second one, I got it and it came across my kind of periphery at that point. I'm just like, right, need to get it before it goes because they would go super quickly. As I said, at the moment, I think they're a bit easier to get a hold of, especially fuller plants as well, rather than just unrooted cuttings. You can still get unrooted cuttings, obviously. And I will say what I always say, if you're watching this in the future, 2-3 years from now, things probably have changed. But as it stands currently at the filming of this video, check the date below, that's the case that I am seeing at least. And yeah, it's one of those things that I had to go and grab it. I grabbed it, but it was just before I was heading away on holiday for 2 weeks. So I had the added stress of didn't have anybody to care for my plants. All my plants went into a very dark bathroom, and this was still propagating. At that point, it was in an opaque container with water and tinfoil on top, and the water was getting changed daily before I left. By that point, I was already starting to get some roots and maybe some secondary roots, the beginnings of some secondary roots. And I knew that it was going to slow it down because it was getting less light than it would normally be because I was going to be away for 2 weeks. But long story very short, I came back, it was fine, it was rooting. It was kind of, I think, a couple of weeks after that I ended up putting it straight into soil, and it started growing at that point in the soil. But yeah, this plant is very near and dear to me because it was the excitement level and the stress of getting this plant. And I think it can be because I think this was one of my first quote unquote rare or harder to come by houseplants. And that excitement that we all get when you're first starting collections and things like that, when you first get your first kind of rare plant. We do need to find better words for these things, but you know what I mean. It can be quite intense. So this was definitely one for me, and this was maybe to no end because this one had the good level of variegation. It was interesting because the moment I stopped hovering on the other one, it started doing great things. The same thing of when I started to lose a bit more interest in this one and I wasn't hovering quite as much. Moral of the story is care a bit less if you can, and generally the plants will kind of get on with it. If hovering too much sometimes causes more issues than it solves potentially. But yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say on the background for this plant. Let's move into the next section. So speed of growth with this, and I briefly did touch on it just now, is, and even kind of moving on from the previous review as well, it has stayed consistent. The thing that has changed a bit on this, and I'll see if it can maybe show up. So this is one leaf, the next leaf is another variegated leaf, then I got an all green leaf, then there's another variegated leaf here with some sectoralness going on, and then there's another green leaf. And the fenestrations, or the splits at least in the leaves, are getting deeper and deeper. I'm not getting any secondary fenestrations on this. There's one on here, which is the actual hole. There was a large debate. I don't even remember if it was the previous video that I did on this, on the terms fenestration. If there's anybody who's scientific out there and there is a consensus that has been reached, please do let everybody know down below, because there was that debate going of, is the split a fenestration, or is the fenestration only what we might be calling the secondary kind of holes along the midrib of the leaf rather than the actual fenestrations themselves. So that's a hot topic of discussion, I think, at the moment. But the splits on the leaves are getting deeper, basically on the green ones. And I'm trying to think, oh yeah, there is a secondary fenestration on that one. There isn't on this one. But the point I was trying to make with this is, as long as you're getting one green leaf and the next one is variegated, even if it alternates that way, I would say keep it if you can. I know for some people it messes with their aesthetic and they want to have a fully variegated plant, but generally I found they stay a lot happier and grow a bit faster because this is a much more efficient way for them to be able to photosynthesize than a leaf that's missing half of its chlorophyll on one side, basically. The half moons are lovely, but it's not the best thing for the plant itself. It looks great for us, not the best thing for the plant itself. But again, I might be going over ground that most people by this point already know. That variegation might be pretty, but it's not in the best interest of the plant to keep a hold of it, especially if it's unstable variegation. So this, the Monstera Albo, is the Monstera that has got unstable variegation, and the Monstera Thai constellation, which I have also done a review on that plant, and that one is a stable variegation. So for the people that maybe don't understand some of these terms, the stable variegation on the Monstera Thai constellation, and I'm pointing that way because it sits that way in my conservatory, sorry, that one is stable in the sense that it doesn't matter what you do with the plant, the variegation will persist. It will come up in different forms. The speckling, sometimes you'll get sectoral, and that's fine. It won't necessarily go away. If I'm not mistaken, it is kind of part of the DNA of the plant. With unstable variegation, these kind of plants tend to want to revert or go back towards their all green form. So it's a bit of a process to kind of make sure that that variegation level stays within the plant. And usually what that means is, if you've had a green leaf, and this is the difference here, is one green leaf does not make a reverted plant, because you might get one green leaf and then you might get, which is happening here basically, so green leaf variegation, green leaf variegation. So it doesn't make a reverted plant. If you do, however, see 2 or 3 green leaves back to back, that might suggest that there is some reversion that is happening on your plant. Again, it's not always the case, because you need to look at things like the stem of the plant and see the variegation there. And sometimes it will be apparent on the outside of the stem, so you'll see the candy striping on that actual stem. Other times, the variegation might still be in there, but it might be lower, and you might get situations where you've got 4 or 5 green leaves and you've let it go and you're just like, you know what, I don't care, it's reverted. I'll let it be reverted. And then all of a sudden the 6th leaf comes out and it's fully variegated, but you can see none of that candy striping on the outside of the stem. It might be because that line of variegation is going through the inside of the stem, so you might not be able to see it. But that is a slightly riskier approach to take, I think, for most people. So most people will generally look at the stem and look at the green foliage and see how many of those might be coming out, and then judge it accordingly as to whether or not they need to chop it back to where the most recent variegated level. So for instance, now I've gone off topic massively here when I'm talking about speed of growth, but it does link into it, is if you've got one green leaf here, you would go down to the previous node that had a leaf that was variegated and chop it down to there, and hope that the next kind of bud that starts growing off of that node is then variegated, and essentially just kind of monitoring it. And the reason why I went so much into the variegation, the unstableness, and all of these things, and where you need to chop it, is because all of this has an effect on the speed of growth of these plants. And that still hasn't changed since my last review. So it is a case that the more green I allow to come onto this plant, so for instance, I mean, just kind of benchmark it against the golden pothos. Before I was getting the green leaf, then variegated leaf, and then green leaf, then variegated leaf, and it was just variegated leaf after variegated leaf after variegated leaf. In the summer, if a golden pothos each month will bring out 2 to 3 leaves, this might bring out 1 or 2 leaves. Now, and that's when it was all variegated leaves. Now, when I've allowed for the green leaves to kind of appear, I'm pretty sure 1, 2, 3, 4 leaves have happened in the last month and a half. in the winter as well. So that gives you an indication of it can speed up the growth. And yes, this is very, very long and lanky. Let me see if I can lift it up so you can just see the height of it. I won't go too high. Again, the people that have been here for a while know that I've got a ceiling fan. Don't want to decapitate this plant. But yeah, you can see as I'm lifting it and trying to not get it to kind of get decapitated, you can see some of the other leaves, and it does go a bit lower, but I can't go much lower than that. And yes, there are some bold parts. There are some bits where I've had to chop and prop, and I will probably be doing the same very soon again, actually. But yeah, generally speed of growth, it's okay. It's not as fast as a green Monstera, the Monstera deliciosa that everybody kind of knows and is aware, I think sometimes called the Swiss cheese plant. But if you get it established enough, it does speed up. I will caveat this heavily and say that when you're first starting off and you've got a single leaf and you're trying to root it out, or if it's already rooted out and you're trying to get the plant to grow, it can be painfully slow. So just bear with it. It will pay out eventually. But yeah, let's move into the next topic. So ease propagation, relatively easy with this one. And again, I'll tell you what I did with my specific plants. I think I've pretty much almost exclusively with my Monsteras propagated them within water, with an opaque container, with the water in it, replacing the water quite frequently. I even put some tinfoil over the water at the top, just so that there's absolutely zero light that will go in there. Anecdotally, do I think it worked a bit faster? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not entirely sure. It wasn't anything massively noticeable. Did I have any algae issues? No. Did I have any root rot issues? No. But again, this has just been my experience. You might try the same thing and you might have different results. I don't think I ever had to have this in a high humidity environment, something like a prop box, in order for it to sprout. However, I do have a chunk of this where I had to take a cutting and there was leaves that were missing. So I just added that into a prop box. And the next video that I'm going to be filming, and hopefully the next video that you'll be seeing this week, will be a repot with me. And I might kind of give that little conch a bit of an honorable mention. And that is the first time that I'm propagating it in moss. And I know a lot of people have propagated it in moss without too much of an issue. So I think that's doing quite well. If I'm not mistaken, the last time I checked, that still didn't have a new leaf on it. But it's been a while since I checked, so maybe in the next video I will be pleasantly surprised and find a little leaf growing somewhere. Now, and I will hopefully be adding pictures here, I have also chopped and propped it, as I've mentioned, mainly because I want to make these bushier plants. Where I'm going to put these bushy plants, I don't know, because actually where this sits at the moment, which is right next to my White Variegated, which is almost the size of a tree now, is very, very narrow space. So actually this fills up that space quite nicely, being quite a long single stem growth point. I would like to put it back in. You probably couldn't see when I lifted it up, but I will touch a bit more on it on accessories and care. But I have transitioned both of my Monsteras now into pon. And I have done that, I'm trying to think, both of these are in regular pon, I think. You're seeing me kind of consider here going, did I put regular pon or did I... maybe not actually. I think this might have been the Soil Ninjas semi-hydro course mix, so it's slightly chunkier. And the reason why I moved both of these into there is because I just wanted to make their watering a bit easier. But again, I'll talk about a bit more about that in my accessories and care video. The point I was trying to make is that I've moved them into, so there's quite a few Albo cuttings that we're rooting out. Unfortunately, one or two of them is struggling at the moment, and you should be able to see that from the video or picture that I'm going to insert somewhere around here. The other one, which is a cutting of my first Monstera, which is more green, that is also in pon, and that one's doing a bit better. I think the first batch of cuttings that I had were doing quite well. They were in the smaller container with pon, but I think they were already in a water reservoir. I bunched them together, put them into another vessel, took away the water reservoir, thinking, you know what, it's winter, they probably don't need it as much. And I think that may have stressed out the plant and it started to get some root rot. So a lot of the leaves are potentially dropping, and you should see that video or the image that I mentioned should actually have a clear indication of that. However, I can see, because I've got one of the Soil Ninjas, I don't think they're the ones that make it. It's somebody else that makes it and they sell it. The arrowed tower pots, they are clear, so I can see through, and I can see that new roots are coming through. So it should be fine, and it will bounce back, and I'm not so worried. I've got two very large established plants. If I need to take cuttings from them again, I can. So moving into the topic of availability. This has changed drastically, even since the last time I was talking about this, because at the last point when I was talking about this a year ago, they were starting to come up on the market a bit more and more established plants. Usually the more established plants would have been kind of very low treble digits, at least here in the UK. I think these have now started going down to high double digits currently. Again, here in the UK, might be the same in Europe. I don't know with this one specifically, but I know that at some point, a couple of years ago, there was a huge influx of these that came over from the Netherlands and some of the nurseries there. So they are probably available. There is a debate on whether or not some of these growers are holding back just so they can kind of stimulate demand a bit more, because if there isn't that many available, people really would like them and they tend to go quite quickly. This, as well as the Monstera type constellation. I am still not seeing that many Monstera type constellations coming out. I am seeing more of the Albos coming out now in full plant form. And it comes back to what I was saying in previous videos as well, that depending on the plant and depending on your patience, you might not have to spend, because even when I was buying my plants many, many years ago, there's people that could have potentially been paying low triple digits for an unrooted cutting with a single leaf. And now for the same kind of price, roughly, they might be paying for a full established plant with 7 or 8 leaves. So, and there was something that happened as well, because a lot of the Albos came out during lockdowns and things like that. And a lot of people actually started planty businesses, whether or not some of those are still around, but they found it as a good way to kind of supplement their income, especially if they've maybe lost their jobs, if they were furloughed, all of these things where they were getting huge Monstera Albos. They were selling out super quickly, even more so than normal, and chopping the Albos out and either selling the unrooted cuttings or rooting them out and then selling it and making a profit that way. There was a lot of heated debate about did people kind of agree with that happening, regardless of what your opinion might have been on the situation. At least my view is it helped some people survive the kind of lockdowns and the pandemic and the uncertainty of financial situations and all of these things. So it did serve a bit of a purpose. And maybe it's a kind of romantic way of me looking at it, but it was nice because it almost felt like some of the plants that we all love and care for were kind of giving back to the community. There is a side note to say that a lot of people that really aren't into plants and never were into plants did this to make a quick buck. That's a different story altogether. But for the people that are still interested and passionate about plants and they did this, go you, because essentially your plants help you survive something that was probably quite worrying and stressful for a lot of people. I have gone on so many tangents today. Sorry. But availability generally with this one, it's becoming a lot more available even a year later after my previous video. So coming into pests with this, and this is a bit that again maybe hasn't changed that much. Since the last time, have I had a lot of pests on this last year? No, but I didn't really have much, touch wood, didn't really have much of a thrip infestation in my space. There was maybe a tiny bit on a couple of plants that I dealt with, and luckily it didn't spread. But yeah, it's thrips. Unfortunately, monsteras generally are something that thrips are attracted to. This one occasionally, maybe once, has had spider mites, but they got dealt with really easily because the leaves are quite leathery. And I generally find that spider mites don't like that too much. And I'm trying to think what else. Mealybugs on this, ironically enough, no. Even though it's probably around plants that do have mealybugs. This one hasn't had mealybugs. But also because of the leaves being as exposed as they are, I'd be able to kind of see it and deal with it a lot more. It's annoying because most of my mealybug issues tend to be on plants with nooks and crannies everywhere, and there's a lot of them. And then I'm just like, I'm going to need to spend like half a day just unpicking one plant's worth of mealybugs. Joy. But yeah, generally speaking, thrips are going to be a big thing. Maybe the occasional mealybug and maybe a tiny bit of spider mites, but that is really it. Fungus gnat issues. If you've got fungus gnat issues on this, you've probably not just got fungus gnat issues. It means your soil is staying too wet, and these plants tend to go towards root rot quite quickly. So if you've got fungus gnats, yes, deal with the fungus gnats, but I would also say at that point, check your roots, because you might have the beginnings of root rot and you have not realized, because the environment that fungus gnats need in order to be happy is an environment that the roots of this specific plant would probably be quite unhappy. So that's my 2 cents on that one. But yeah, let's move on to the next topic. So accessories and care for this one. So I've probably got a bit to say on this one. Obviously, for the eagle-eyed amongst you, as a whole, janky support sticks for both of these plants, actually. No, I'm looking at my other Monstera, and that one has actually got the sorriest excuse for a moss pole pre-bought one, like a bought one from a shop. Didn't need very much, but it's offering it some support, and you will need something to support. These plants can get quite heavy the larger they get. There's a lot of plant and there's a lot of stem and all of these things. So, and they will root, aerial roots for days. This is one of the shortest ones I've got here. So that is also something to remember. The other thing about the care when it comes to the white variegated sections, and it depends. I found that the bigger the plant gets and the more established it is, and the more leaves it has, the more likely it is to keep some of that white variegation on there. Now, I will say you're seeing mine with not an awful lot of crisping. Some of the older leaves did have a bit of crisping that was happening. I'm trying to see if I can lift it up here. There you go. You can see the section that I haven't even cut it off. It's there. It just rolled in the back. That happened, and this was interesting actually. That happened, and it happened every time when I've done it, which is a shame because I had large sectoral leaves that got chopped and propped. They quite quickly, because they had no roots, basically the white sections turned brown really, really quickly. But also what happened was the mother plant, it obviously stressed enough of the plant out that it then started crisping up its own white sectoral sections on the plant. So bear that in mind. I don't know if it was just mine that would do this, but I'd be really curious to see, have you had a similar situation where you take a cutting from your Monstera Albo? Yes, there is a risk that your cutting itself, if it's got white sectoral sections, might go crispy, but I think most of us would expect that. Has your mother plant reacted and has it started crisping up when it wasn't? Now, there is a lot of white on here and it's not crisping up. I will also say that it's in my conservatory. Granted, it gets an awful lot of light, and I'm trying to see if I can't kind of show you here. I might see if I can insert a clip, but there is a lot of bleaching that happens on this plant because this gets bashed down with light. This sits in one of the brightest sections of my conservatory. So yeah, it gets beat down with light. However, my conservatory, for the people that have been here for a while, can be really, really humid. So because it's really, really humid, that will help to keep the whiteness on the leaves. But as I've mentioned on previous videos, it's not just the humidity sometimes. If you get the watering just right, that should help with that, the kind of keeping of the white less crispy, at least I have found. So there is that to kind of consider. As I've mentioned in the earlier section, I have transitioned them into pon or semi-hydro. And the reason why that happened is because the previous year I had moved my Monstera Thai Constellation into a semi-hydro mix, or let's choose a pon at that point, and it really, really did enjoy it. Yes, there was a transitional period. Yes, it didn't get a water reservoir. These both still do not have a water reservoir. But that didn't get, the Thai Constellation didn't get a water reservoir until I saw quite a few roots coming down the bottom of its kind of pot, basically into what would eventually become its water reservoir. And then did I start using a water reservoir. And to be fair with this plant as well, it doesn't get too stressed when it's established. I know I mentioned that in my propagates, I had a few issues, but when it's established, I find that in the winter, I can kind of let the water reservoir go dry for a lot longer between waterings, and this plant doesn't get too stressed with it because it doesn't need quite as much water in the winter. In the summer, it does go through its water reservoir quite quickly, and I do top it up. Uh, Not super quick, so if the water reservoir in the semi-hydro has fully been absorbed or evaporated if it's summer, because that happens too, so much fun, then I might leave it for like a few days, maybe 4 or 5 days of it being dry before I then re-wet it. I don't want to leave it for too much longer because then sometimes you do get root rot, but I also don't want to go, oh, it's if you've dried out your water reservoir, let me fill it up immediately as soon as I see that you've kind of used up all the water. That also can lead to root rot. So yeah, there are intricacies to this plant. There is a lot of us that have got this. There's a lot of us that have grown it for a while, which to me again would suggest that as long as you kind of it clicks in your brain as soon as you know what you're doing right and what it likes and doesn't like, it then becomes easier to care for this plant. Is it the most prima donna-esque plant in my collection and in my experience? No. Can it be for some people? Yes, but generally I will say that's usually when you're kind of maybe starting out in your collection and you're still learning. But again, I would say, even though this is one of the first rarer plants that I got, and maybe one that had slightly more unique care requirements, this is a good one, actually, I think, when you're first starting off, believe it or not. Because, yes, there's issues, but it's still a Monstera, and they can be quite forgiving. This is the kind of plant that I have seen people that literally have taken it down to like a stump, or maybe even a chonk is the only thing that's remaining, and they were able to slowly bring it back to life. So, in that respect, yes, it can be quite a good plant to have to your collection. And again, based on how many people were interacting with that first video, I was kind of thinking, oh, maybe the Monstera Albo has had its heyday. But actually, I still think this is a plant that is very dear to a lot of people, or people are still trying to find it. And I get it. I do get it. It is that quintessential kind of variegated big plant. It's very much a statement plant, especially if you're growing it in a house and you can keep all the white sectoral bits. I will segue slightly and say there was a slight bit of we've all been lied to ever so slightly when these were starting to get quite popular in the beginning, quite a few years back now, because we were seeing these beautiful, fully kind of pristine white sections, absolutely no crisping pictures on Instagram, and they looked like they were from a magazine. And there was probably a lot of staging that was happening at that point, because anybody for any prolonged period of time that has had one of these knows that it is a great moment when you get everything looking pristine. Is it sustainable in the long run? Probably not, I think most of us would say. There will be some crisping and it won't always look that perfect for the entirety of the plant. Don't get me wrong, when you're getting it from the nurseries in the Netherlands, when you first get it, it's more than likely going to be perfect. Not always. I have still seen some of them in stores that have come in from the nurseries in the Netherlands and they've still got crispy bits. But yeah, it is one of these plants that as long as you're okay with it, it's fine. It's a natural part of it. You can see maybe a tiny bit of crisping, and if you can't, I will see if I can add a clip on the tip of that white section there. And that's again because it might be salt deposits, because again, this gets watered. At the moment, I think it's once a week, and it just gets flushed through. And I always use a very diluted form of my liquid gold leaf fertilizer. And yeah, and it seems to be okay. It's still getting some tiny bit of browning on the tips of the leaves. One of the things I will say now that I've mentioned liquid gold leaf is I will be hopefully retesting this summer the foliar spray, because I had mixed results with it, but I was talking to the team at Liquid Gold Leaf and they were kind of saying, oh, maybe try this and try this. I'm just like, ooh, new things to experiment with. So I will be doing that as the weather starts to get a bit warmer. But yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to say about care and accessories. If you've got your own kind of suggestions, tips, and things like that people might want to use, do drop them down below. But let's move into the next topic. So coming into final thoughts on this plant. Has it changed since the last video that I've done? Probably not. So I'll start how I normally do, is knowing what I know now, and if I didn't have this plant, would I get this plant? 100%. Yeah, This is an easy yes for me because I still enjoy it. Does it bring me that level of excitement and oh wow, I finally got this and it's amazing? Probably not. Um, this is a plant that I would say, and this is an interesting kind of comment. If I didn't have my collection for whatever reason, and I decided, no, I'm not into plants anymore. Don't worry, that's not going to happen anytime soon. But say I'm not into plants anymore. I get rid of most of my collection. There would probably be a few, like a handful of plants that I would probably still keep and then move into my living space as kind of specimen pieces. This specific Albo, to be exact, not the other one that has less variegation, this specific Albo would definitely be making that cut. And that should tell you something. So if everything was to go, this would be one of the few things that would stay. So because I do like it, and if I had the space and I was in the right kind of the layout of my living room and where I live at the moment isn't great. At some point, this house was always going to be a transitional purchase for me. It's kind of like a fixer upper, so I'm fixing it up to eventually sell it to then move into more of a forever home, and I will be a bit more specific, pedantic about what I choose for my living room and how the light comes in. This would then potentially move into that space because I still do like this to be in my living space because it's a beautiful plant still to look at, and it's not a particularly fussy plant as well. So there is that. But scoring wise, and again, because my memory is shockingly bad, I will put what score I had on my previous video and say that how would I score this now? I would still score this, I think it's about the same score, an 8 or a 9 out of 10. So relatively high. Yes, I'm taking some points off because it can be a bit of a learning curve, especially if you're just starting out, but it's still a very cool plant. It still brings me a lot of joy, and I think it does for a lot of you out there as well. I also know that it brings a lot of stress to a lot of you out there as well. I am not diminishing that, and I promise it can get better. And if it doesn't, it might not be a plant that you can mesh with well and maybe try something else. As I always say, not just with this plant, any plant, I generally can't keep most ferns alive for all love or money. I've got people that have got the most beautiful fern collections out there, but maybe they might not be able to keep a Monstera happy. Lean into your strengths. And you know what? Even if it isn't your strength and you're very good with ferns, but you're not good with Monsteras, for instance, and you want to try Monsteras, do you basically, but learn along the way, and eventually this can become one of your strengths as well. But way too many side stories on this one. I do apologize, although I think some of you do enjoy it based on the comments that you leave down below. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.